Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on Perspectives with Asima Silva, as always, coming to you from the studios of WCCA TV right here on Main Street in Worcester. And Asima, right now in the city of Worcester, we have 350 Afghan refugees who have come to the city. We may get as many as 500. This is an effort that the Chamber, the welcoming effort, is an effort by the Chamber of Commerce and by Tim Garvin, who is kind of spearheading things for the United Way of Central Massachusetts, also involving people such as Tony Economou, who is, spearheading the finding a place with a booming housing market, finding a place for people to be able to live. So against that backdrop, you have a guest who is somebody that I'm going to let you introduce them via your personal story of how you met, who has grown up here in the United States, but certainly has a unique perspective on what some of the refugees coming to our community may face, and a little bit about the cultural background and how it may differ as they arrive here in the States.
Yes, thank you, Hank, for the introduction. We have a great speaker and a guest today, Wais Achikzad. Did I get that right? But what I wanted to share with you is how we met. As Hank just mentioned, we have many Afghan refugees in Worcester County. And I started seeing on social media people asking about what kind of culture do they have? How should I be treating them? What should I be expecting if I want to help out with these refugees? Because some of these refugees are going to school. They're students in our school systems, K through 12. They're young adults. They're adults trying to find work and housing, as you said. And I kept thinking in my head, I really wish I knew someone who could communicate clearly, who could give their perspective and speak for the Afghani people and speak some experiences, not only of themselves, but for the Afghani people, of the experiences they're experiencing coming here as refugees. And coincidentally, over the winter vacation, my family, my husband and my kids, we decided to do a day visit to New York for food. And we walked into a restaurant. And we were the only people there, along with 3 other people. And it was a small restaurant. So as I'm sitting there, and I never eavesdrop on people's conversations. In fact, if I'm sitting on a table, people usually struggle to get my attention, to pay attention to them. But coincidentally, I happened to sit very close to these 3 other people, who Wes was one of. And the conversation was so interesting. And I kept saying to my husband, but this conversation I want to be in, like I want to interject. And he's just looking at me like, don't do it. We just came here for food. Like, you don't even know where you are. We're in the middle of New York City. You don't do it. And I couldn't help myself, because the topics of their conversation was exactly what I kept saying to my husband is, this is the conversation we want on our show. This is what the perspective I want. So I coincidentally had the courage, couldn't help myself, while my kids started going, oh God, here goes mom again, and turned around and I just interjected and I said, sorry to eavesdrop, but I heard what you guys were saying, and I'd like to know more about the topic you guys are talking about. So Wes, why don't you give us the introduction of me interjecting into your conversation and how we got onto this topic, and then lead us into your background as an Afghani American.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you both for allowing me to come onto your program, and to the audience. Happy New Year to everyone. So it was I believe it was Christmas Eve, and we were just sitting there. I had a couple of friends who were just talking geopolitics and sort of the state of the world. And obviously, I was born and raised in the United States, but my parents are from Afghanistan. I'm from Afghanistan and Afghanistan, I want to say properly. And we still have a lot of ties there. We were just simply talking about some of the relationships in that area with the Afghanis and the Pakistanis and the India and even China, and just sort of how everyone's so interconnected, and kind of what the politics of that area currently are sort of, what's being realized on the ground there based on the political sort of policies that have taken shape after the Americans evacuated the country, and sort of the aftermath of that. I think, there's a lot to unpack there. and there's always varying views. But I think a lot of that just stems from people's, there's a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, but also, the media doesn't exactly portray the situation as it probably is or could be portrayed. But I think, the conversation that we had, also, we talked a little about the refugee situation here in the United States. And, I've been one to, having been fortunate to have been given a life here, with my father and my mom. And we came here when I was 9 years old. But I was born and raised here, but my father worked for the United Nations. And, I was afforded the ability to leave the strife that was going on in Afghanistan at the time with the Russian occupation, and allowed an education here. And I've been in the finance industry for the last 25 years here in New York. So, it's time for me we have been doing this for some time, but just giving back in any way we can. And there's a level of guilt associated with seeing what our people have been contending with all these years, even before this past summer with the refugee situation and the evacuation of the country. I think even with the Taliban occupation and the first time around, when the Soviets were there, we were one of the lucky ones who were able to get out and carve out lives for ourselves. And there's a level of guilt associated with that. And I think that never goes away. And the only way you can deal with that really is to try to do what you can individually and with whatever groups you affiliate yourself that will help on the situation there on the ground. And in this case, we have a situation there on the ground, which is dire, obviously with the humanitarian crisis, but also with the evacuees and those that are displaced currently and that are housed in 6 military bases across various states. And it's a problem, right? It's like, what do you do with them after they're somewhat indoctrinated into the society here, and how do they assimilate? So there's a lot there, and that's kind of the topics that we were discussing at the restaurant and how we met. So.
Yeah, so now you understand why I had to interject.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right there. There certainly is a lot there to unpack. You had mentioned the feelings of guilt, and I wonder if here in the United States there aren't many Americans who also have some feelings of guilt. We watch the images, the chaotic, to put it mildly, withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the feelings of guilt of we made promises. Here were people who wanted to get out, wanted to come to America or other countries because they wanted that freedom, the horrible image of the individual who wanted it so badly that he even got into the wheel well of a plane. But I think that there is also the reality of what you were just saying. So now, for example, Worcester or any other city beginning to absorb this number of refugees, I don't know how long for a lot of Americans are feelings of guilt and how can we help? And then wait a minute, jobs and schooling and, how we sort of have that. Worcester can do it. But we were told 300 refugees, for example. Now we're at 350. The number's probably going to be 500. So my understanding is that we are scrambling a little bit to try and figure out how, after the first year or so, where's the housing coming from? How do you get meaningful jobs for individuals who were professors, professionals in Afghanistan, but now there may be something of a language barrier to get those type of jobs here in the States? And how does it all start to shake out? I don't know if there's a question in there, but those are some of the things that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, without question. So I'm affiliated a little bit with the New Jersey Coalition for Afghans. They are helping the Afghan refugee population in the tri-state area assimilate as best they can. They're housed in, I think it's Fort Dix, and it's one of those situations where it's quite startling when you actually unpack what's going on at these locations. I think, yes, if you really look back at how this all manifested itself and promises that were made, all those things that from a policy perspective, we can go back and question policy, like why are we here in this first place, right? That obviously, look, hindsight's 2020. Sometimes policies, that are made result in situations like this. And, I don't want to get too political in terms of my personal opinions. We can delve into that at some point. But we are where we are, right? So whatever was done back then, we can hash and rehash and what should have been done, what shouldn't have been done. The fact is, it was done. The United States left Afghanistan in that position, knowing full well that the Taliban would take over. Actually, President Trump is the one who actually formally made that agreement with the Taliban prior to President Biden coming on board. So the groundwork is essentially laid already, and Biden essentially just executed what was agreed originally, right? And so he didn't have to do that, but that was the agreement made at the time. And I think now that we're there, we just have to deal with the now, right? And so when you look at the situation with, I believe the official numbers that the U.S. government would put out there is about 53,000 evacuees as part of these 6 different camps or bases, army bases. Was 8, it's down to 6 now. But speaking to those actually more intimately involved, there's actually about 80-something thousand. And so the situation in these bases it's pretty startling. It's like a little city, a little village, where you're putting together all these Afghan refugees who are, a lot of them don't know the language, a lot of them are just literally a fish out of water, and then there are some who have a certain background and who have an education, but are then trying to figure out how to get themselves back into society here. And within those the villages that are there now, it's almost like a village within the forts. You're seeing just some horrific conditions, actually, to be honest with you, which are not reported in the media. So the conditions are not so great. There is a lot of things that you find in our own societies, you'll find in those military bases, just with regards to domestic violence, families who are going through their own issues, medical issues, just issues with children, just things that we all face, but in a more concentrated area, which sort of exacerbates the situation. And look, the resources from a government perspective, from a military perspective, from community perspective, they're limited. So how much care do they get? It's really difficult to allocate the right amount of resources for what they really need. So essentially, it's a prison, for lack of a better way. It's a prison. If they were to go out of the fort, they are allowed. They're allowed to go out of the fort at times, but the general direction that they're given is to stay within the fort. And if they do go for any extended period of time, then they are told not to come back. And if you're going to leave here, then you're not to come back. So essentially, they're imprisoned. And now it's, well, how do we find jobs? To your point earlier, for them, how do we make them? How do we have them assimilate into our society? And it's going to take quite a long period of time, and for the true resettlement to occur in a way which will benefit our communities, the Afghans themselves, and it's going to take a lot for these communities to welcome them also, right? We're going through everyone's going through their own sort of struggles within their communities, and now we're asking, and by the way, there's more on their way. There's a group in Buffalo that I'm working with that is settling in shortly. So they reach out to us and they look for best practices and what kind of programs do you have in place, vocational training, all these things that it just needs a lot of resources. It's very costly and to the taxpayer but we put ourselves in this position, and I think our obligation now is to see it through, and otherwise we've already done a disservice to a degree from a policy standpoint. Now it's time to reckon with sort of the aftermath and deal with it in a way which will uphold the dignity of the Afghan people here and also benefit the communities around, because they are able-bodied and they can certainly contribute to our societies. And I think there's potential there. We just have to unite within our communities and get the appropriate support from our federal and state agencies.
It's not the typical immigrant experience. It's a lot of people,
Right.
And 50,000 people arrive in the United States. What is it, 20 or 70,000? 20,000 are still on these bases. Even if another 150 come to Worcester County, it leaves an awful lot of people still looking for homes and where to go.
Right.
Absolutely.
So Wais, you said you were raised in America. As an Afghani. Do you mind sharing some of your experiences? Because I'm assuming, must be a very unique experience, especially with the political climate that we had in this country.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. When you first, as a child and just growing up here, you're just trying to fit in with all the other children. I guess I was somewhat lucky in that I liked to play sports, and I was pretty good at soccer, I guess, and helped me sort of fit in with the other kids, and eventually I played baseball and all those things. So we were relatively lucky. I didn't experience a lot of backlash, or when you're kids, like, people really don't care where you come from. They may care about what you look like or color your skin and those things. But luckily, me and my brother, Dula, we didn't face a lot of that, luckily. And I know a lot of people do. Our community in Westchester, New York, I think took us in very well. We were the only Afghan family in all of. We lived in a little town called Larchmont in New York. But I think as I sort of matured and went to high school, and I had just started to work in the finance industry when 9/11 happened. And actually, the building that I was working in was right across the street from 9/11. And I had just resigned from my role literally a week before. Otherwise, knowing me, I probably would have been curious and tried to help people and got into that area. So God works in mysterious ways. But being in that industry after 9/11, losing colleagues, I lost a few colleagues, not colleagues, but clients that were in the towers. And I was just in those towers about 3 weeks prior to 9/11. There was definitely a lot of resentment towards what happened. I mean, predictably so and understandably so. I faced a lot of people knew where I was from, so they questioned it. I definitely received a lot of I would say there was some vitriol. There was some from some people who were, but I use it as an opportunity to educate, right? To me, it was an opportunity to truly let people know what was going on, who the Afghan people are versus, who Al Qaeda is versus Taliban versus, there's a huge distinction between all of them. And so for me, I've always used it as an opportunity to educate people where I'm from. And as the years have progressed and what's happened just recently, I think those around me certainly are aware because I speak about it quite frequently. And I think the more knowledge we all have, the better we are for it. And so for me, it's always been a sort of desire of mine to educate those around me so that I'm not stereotyped. Forget me, but just the Afghan people in general and what are we about? And we have such a rich history and, such a welcoming and warm people that, there's all these misconceptions about terrorism and kind of Afghanistan's association with it. And yes, there are those stereotypes. And yes, I have my, family members who've been impacted by that. And so it hurts. But I think the message I give to those that are impacted are just simply try to educate and give people the facts and through your actions, right? Your actions speak louder than your words. And how do you treat people? Are you hospitable?
Do you mind
Are you
giving us
welcoming?
the information that you were talking about that you enlighten with people with the difference between the Taliban and Al Qaeda and just for our own education and our viewers' education of if you could enlighten us about the differences in the history.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Afghan people, after the Russians invaded our country, part of the coalition to try to extract the Russians from there were obviously the Americans armed the Mujahideen. And let's face it, Osama bin Laden was one of them. And he had his Saudi contingent. And mostly he called for action for Muslims all over. And obviously the resources from the Saudis and his family and obviously was also instrumental in what happened with the Soviets ultimately. And so once the Soviets were extracted from Afghanistan, obviously there was a coalition of Muslims that had congregated within Afghanistan and led by Osama bin Laden. And during that period of time, and once the Americans left sort of a vacuum in that area. And then obviously those individuals who were there, who had helped liberate Afghanistan, were left with looking at the rest of the world and sort of how the Muslims were treated, whether it's in Palestine or, all over the world. And again, it was American policy and how was it impacting the Muslim world. And so from that sort of manifested what we see with Al Qaeda in terms of a group of Muslims banding together to take action where they feel, again, some people will call them terrorists, some people will call them freedom fighters, right? Depending on which perspective that you look at objectively. And then the Taliban really are a manifestation of a group in Pakistan in the madrasas. The madrasas are the schools in Pakistan where they teach Islam, where you literally are looking at the Quran and your belief system is based on the literal interpretation of each word in the Quran, and that's how you live your life, right? And that's what's taught in these schools. That Pakistani influence and that sort of that sort of eventually sort of morphed into kind of the Taliban. If you look at the Taliban now coming into Afghanistan, a lot of them lived in Pakistan and fought all these years also, and they're not necessarily educated other than the Quran, if that. But they're fighters. They're not in any way, shape, or form able to lead a country, right? They just don't have the wherewithal and the education to be able to lead a whole country, which they're now tasked with. But Pakistan plays a role in sort of cultivating that the whole sort of the Taliban presence, and it's a very interesting sort of dynamic right now in that region and with Pakistan and Afghanistan. And listen, I have my best friends are Pakistani, right? So I have no ill will towards my Pakistani brethren. But inevitably, when these things arise politically, you start to see some divisions within your friends and family, or and it's sad to see. But I certainly make a concerted effort to kind of distinguish between the politics and actual. We're all Muslims at the end of the day. We're all people. And so, I certainly don't let it impact, my circle of friends and family. But that's sort of, hopefully that answers your question about some of the distinctions.
But really then, so under the influence or under this sphere of Pakistan, so what do you see the next few years holding for Afghanistan?
Well, it's interesting because let's face it, the Pakistan government is really run by the ISI and their intelligence and their military. And so Imran Khan, I think, who's the current prime minister, who's got some Afghan blood actually, he's a proponent of trying to create a solution, and he's very, he's making an effort to a degree, but to bring the countries together. But I think, with China now involved, let's face it, Afghanistan is rich with natural resources, lithium, trillions of dollars. And so I think this is an opportunity for China to sort of involve itself and gain the upper hand here with regards to, and I think it's in their best interest to create, we're neighbors, so they want to create sort of a harmonious region rather than sort of the chaos that has existed in the past. So I think the history is interesting also, but also the dynamics of the U.S. military. The U.S. government supporting the Pakistani government, who then supports the Taliban. There's also that interesting dynamic of, okay, well, if you really wanted to stop what was going on with the Taliban, you could have, because you are supporting Pakistani military. I'm talking about the U.S. government. And so it's really interesting if you really objectively look at it. And there are questions I would have for our think tanks, for our those in power, just to kind of talk about those things. I'll never have the answers to those things as to why policies are made the way they are. But it's interesting if you really delve into the details and see kind of how it's interesting. It raises a lot of other questions, right? But the future, it's hard to say. Right now, there's a humanitarian crisis on a level that a population of 39 million people, and 24 million of them are suffering right now with starvation and with the winter currently that they're contending with, and $9.5 billion of assets frozen, not accessible to the Taliban. What does that do? That hurts the people. And why are the funds frozen? Because the Taliban are not recognized as a government, right? And so until their ask of the international community and the U.S. in particular is that the Taliban show more respect towards women, having them more inclusive, sort of in everyday life, being able to go to school, also having a more inclusive government. There's, as we all know, the Afghans are a very diverse people. There's various sects. There's the Hazaras, Tajiks, Uzbeks. Do they have a place in government, right? And so those are all, unless they show that they're inclusive and including women in government, because we were trending towards that before the Taliban came in. Women were doctors and lawyers, and they've done some great things in these last 20 years. But until they show that, look, they're really truly changing their ways rather than that initial PR campaign that the Taliban had, that Taliban 2.0 is completely different.
And I think that is where we're going to have to end our conversation tonight, Asima, because we just have a minute left, just enough time to get your perspective.
So I wanted to just share while we're wrapping up this show. You might be wondering, why did I interject into that conversation? And I want to reiterate the reason why I interjected was not only on the topic, but of course, my kids and my husband were a little bit hesitant because they were like, we don't know these people. We're in New York City. You can't just jump into someone's conversation. But what I did over here, and as Wais, was very great to actually mentioning it on our show today, was I overheard him say, depending upon which perspective you're coming from, some people may consider a group freedom fighters, and some people may consider that same group terrorists. And so when I heard him say that, I knew that this person could probably appreciate my curiosity wanting to jump into the conversation, and that I also wanted his perspective on our show. So God works in mysterious ways. I was looking for someone to talk about this topic, and next thing you know, I ended up sitting next to him. So hopefully we'll have him again on another show to talk more about this topic, since it's such a enormous amounts of questions and information that we want. But hope you join again on our next show with Perspectives with Asima Silva.